What is resistance journalism? Resistance journalism is a trailblazing method of investigative journalism utilizing arguably hazardous methods of reporting in order to bring justice to particularly contentious and sometimes debatable cases. Ronan Farrow has been the face of what is now pitched as resistance journalism. Ben Smith from the New York Times wrote a case against the usually applauded Farrow in an article for the Times. He describes Farrow as taking an otherwise unorthodox approach to journalism. Journalists usually start out as investigative reporters and work their way up the ladder from there, though in Farrow's case, he began as a talk show host on a show called The Ronan Farrow Daily, a television program that aired on MSNBC, and went into investigative journalism after. Smith insists that while Farrow has been part and parcel of many controversial stories, much of the time he fails to corroborate, a typical exercise by journalists that further ensures the integrity of their work. Smith describes corroboration as the painstaking task of tracking down friends and neighbors a traumatized victim may have confided in soon after the assault to see if their accounts align with the victim's story, to give it more or less weight. He adds that while Ronan does not lie, he does mislead, perhaps showing a slippery slope in investigative journalism that motivates journalists to conduct rather damaging reporting about public figures, because the usual measures taken in journalism, such as corroboration and rigorous disclosure, may manifest themselves as impediments rather than aids to reporting.
Thanks, Nate. To add on to that, Ronan Farrow is the investigative journalist who wrote the groundbreaking article on the Harvey Weinstein case. Farrow played a critical role in revealing Weinstein's predatory behavior, playing the role of a catalyst in taking him down. The Weinstein debacle began as a slew of accusations of sexual harassment, which were reported days earlier by the New York Times, before Farrow published a shocking piece that led New York prosecutors to charge Weinstein with rape. Farrow also had an important role in breaking other stories related to the Me Too movement. He and Jane Meyer worked together to uncover the first sexual misconduct allegation against Brett Kavanaugh, which ended up becoming the central focus of Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings. He was even a target of Jeffrey Epstein's threats when that story began to break, as he had a role in breaking of that story too. The Kavanaugh piece and its almost complete lack of corroboration led to Farrow receiving a lot of criticism for his methods, though he has since doubled down on them. So, how should we view Farrow? Should we be more empathetic? A journalist's work will not always be perfect and cannot satisfy everybody's opinions, nor meet everyone's expectation. There are many methods of journalism, and some methods just don't appeal to as many people. One important thing when criticizing pieces of journalism is aiming to view the journalism as well-intentioned. We want to assume that the reporter is trying to spread the truth rather than attributing ulterior motives. With that said, in order to make any progress, we cannot be complete skeptics and deny everything, nor can we refuse to critically assess the media. All the while, we should be rigorously analyzing the measures employed. The underlying point is this: reflexively taking sides based on partisan affiliation is a symptom of our heavily polarized political climate, and it is fundamentally antithetical to the humanity-forward mindset. That's what we're here for. That's what we're here to talk about. Resistance journalism. The good, the bad, and of course, how to move forward.
Thank you, Chris. So how do we move forward? First, we need to understand the underlying problem of what's fueling resistance journalism, and that's data analytics on social media. Social media can drive reach, impact, engagement for whatever journalists write. Right now, they're optimizing towards what's the highest likes, what will get retweeted, and that's most often negative commentary, especially in online spaces. In the past, our local journalists and local journalism institutions have been eradicated, bought up by conglomerates, or just going under, with local newspapers degrading our trusted institutions, leading to hyper-partisanship, and several other problems. Enter Andrew Yang, long-shot Democratic presidential candidate. At this point in political discourse, he's a rather popular figure. But what does he have to say about resistance journalism? One of his 160 policies brought forth a new plan for journalistic funding. I will initiate the local journalism fund, Andrew wrote, dedicated $1 billion to help local newspapers, periodicals, and websites transition to a sustainable new era. Investing in the next era of journalists will be paramount for the survivability of our democracy in combating resistant journalism. Media failures are straining political divisions, making citizens less informed, and decimating our local institutions. By taking an active democratic responsibility for the sanctity of our information, we can help the demand for a new marketplace of news by decreasing costs associated with traditional journalistic measures. What we need to do is start targeting why newspapers cannot get funding, and why our establishments have to turn towards resistance journalism. By investing into these communities, they will incentivize quality journalistic techniques and be able to move forward out of this mess called resistance journalism. That was Chris Cantrillo, Nate Belcher, and Kyle Hendon with this special report. Now, on to Step Forward and Talk. Thank you guys, and stay tuned.
Hello, and welcome to Step Forward and Talk. Today we sit down with the founder of Cracked Up Politics and his correspondent, a blog dedicated to making the world of today's politics more understandable for the youth generation. The founder is Chase Walther. He is studying aerospace engineering at Arizona State University. He has a passion for politics and has worked with Congressman Paul Gosar's campaign. Also joining us is Hayden Bergden, penning his technology, working out. He's helping out as a correspondent, studying supply chain management at ASU, as well as public area management. Thank you for coming on, Chase.
Thank you very much for having me.
So you recently wrote an article. Can you tell us a little bit about what it's about?
Yeah, so the most recent article I put up on Cracked Up Politics is called Why Joe Biden Will Win the 2020 Election. It was an analysis of a map recently released by the Biden campaign of all of the states in which they are placing targeted campaigns throughout the 2020 election. So for the same reason why no Republican wastes their time and money in California, no Democrat's going to waste their time and money in Wyoming. But there are a list of a substantive around 10 to 12 states in which the Biden team believes that they can get a foothold in the 2020 election, and those are the states I wanted to analyze. And ultimately, if their strategy works, they will end up winning the 2020 election.
So real quick, we might have found Hayden. Hayden, can you speak and see if you're good? Oh, that's a crisp voice.
Hayden.
So we're gonna get right into it. So Chase, before we start talking about the primary, why is Vice President Biden a better choice for our country than President Trump?
So I feel like, so personally, I've lived my life with a saying that my English teacher told me back in high school when we were all getting ready to turn the age to vote. And it was simply saying, voting isn't like getting married. You aren't waiting for the perfect person to come around that's going to make life happy for you. It's like taking public transit. If there's not a bus stop exactly where you want to go, you don't go home and cry. You take the bus to the stop that's the closest. Neither of these candidates are my cup of tea, personally. I was a big Pete Buttigieg fan when he was in the race. However, we're left with what many people see as the lesser of two evils. And while I hate every election seems to be the lesser of two evils, Joe Biden's stances on healthcare, immigration, as well as just the economy in general, are a lot more aligned with what I personally believe. There are many aspects in which I don't believe Joe Biden does enough, or maybe he does more than I would like, but the candidate that gets me closest to the America that I see 4 years from now is Joe Biden.
No one can fault you for that. Hayden, do you agree with that diagnosis?
Yes, sir, I would agree with that diagnosis.
So that does leave the interesting question before we start getting in specifics in how do groups at the ends of the spectrums get their policies in alignment? Because the big worry with people that do not want to vote for the lesser of two evils is that it just keeps pushing whatever party further to the right or to the left, in this case to the right. So for the people on the far left, how would you convince them to vote for Biden?
Hayden, if you want to start with that one.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the big issues that we saw during this primary season was a really competitive race between Bernie Sanders and the field of moderate candidates that were in the Democratic primary. And as we've kind of, coalesced the Democratic primary to having a presumptive nominee in Joseph Biden, I think that the real big thing for especially progressives in the Democratic Party, from Justice Democrats to other branches of that party, I think the best way that they can be incorporated is through different, I guess, just having a seat at the table for the policy. And not only having a seat at the table for the Democratic Party when they're drafting policy, but also when they're implementing this policy. So one thing that we could see in 2020 is there have been different climate panels that have been formed with people like Representative Ocasio-Cortez heading up a few of those, and just different kind of these olive branches that can be extended out to the progressive wing of the Democratic Party to show them that this is a whole entire, like, this is a countrywide reform on the policies that we've seen from the administration over the last 4 years. And I think that's something that a lot of progressive Democrats can get behind, is that, this is just the start. This election is just the start of the policies that they've been crying for the last 20 years for some of them. So that's what I would say to a lot of progressive Democrats, is that this is just the start to have that influence over policy. And Joseph Biden gives you a much better shot at having an influence over policy than the current administration does.
Is there nothing to be said? Oh, sorry, Jace, you can continue.
Very good. And to piggyback off of that, as much as it pains me to say, I don't think America is ready for a progressive president. If you look back at all of the presidents we've had up until 2016, they've all been, in recent history, moderate centrist of the road candidates that can have broad appeal to both sides. And while we have a growing progressive movement in the United States, I don't think until at least 2024 at the earliest, but more than likely 2028, America will have progressed enough where we can even begin to consider a candidate as progressive as, say, Bernie Sanders, or in a different respect, Elizabeth Warren.
However, who exactly is we in your analysis? Because I think you might be referring to educated, college-educated voters might not be ready for a progressive, but you've seen the working classes on the Republican and Democratic side go for these populist figures.
Yeah, so when I'm referring to we, I'm referring to as America as a whole, and I know that's a very general saying to assume everyone is in the exact same boat, because as a matter of fact, that's not the case. But when it comes to elections, if you're in a state, all it takes is one vote more than your competitor to win the entire state. So if the country as a whole in the 2016 and now 2020 primaries hasn't coalesced behind a progressive candidate, I think it's fair to say that while a growing number of people in the United States are ready for progress and are ready for change, America as a whole, especially with the age groups of 45 and up, aren't ready to see that the ideals they grew up in change, whether for the better or the worse, depending on which side of the aisle you're on. I think that the best way for progressive voices to get a foothold within government is to do what AOC did in running for Congress. Because while the executive branch is great and the president is the figurehead of the country, laws are made in the House and the Senate. And so if in my opinion, if progressives want to get their foot in the door until America is ready to vote in as a whole a progressive ticket, the best way to do that is to have their feet in the door when it comes to making legislation and when it comes to when it comes to making the laws that govern our country.
That all makes sense. In your piece, Chris, you kind of demonstrated what Biden needs to do to win upcoming states. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to start by asking you a little bit about what states need to protect. So you highlight Nevada and Colorado, but in Nevada, and this kind of stems to a larger problem the Biden campaign has right now, he has low enthusiasm and approval ratings in the Latino community. So what are some ways he can overcome that, and why is that important for him to win Nevada?
I think every state that Hillary Clinton won in 2016 is vitally important for Joe Biden to win in 2016. And both candidates' path to winning involves them holding on to all of the states they won in 2016. For Trump, he has to hold on to all of them in order to win. For Biden, he has to hold on to all of them and expand in order to win. But when it comes to the Latino population, I'm going to pass it over to Hayden. He's done a lot of research on the Latino population of the United States. I feel like he can best speak onto that side.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Chase. I think when discussing Joe Biden's popularity among the Latino population, some ways that I think the Democratic Party and the Joe Biden campaign specifically for president can overcome a lot of, I guess, the shortcomings that have been labeled in the media about his appeal among them.
Well, let's not just say the media.
Right.
His approval ratings in the polling is very clear.
Correct. And I think, among both candidates, we see pretty low approval ratings. One way that I see that the Biden campaign can overcome a lot of those low approval ratings that the current administration cannot is through their vice president pick. One of the current individuals who's in the running to become the vice president of the United States, at least on the Biden ticket, is Catherine Cortez Masto, who currently serves as the U.S. Senator from the state of Nevada. And now, especially because we're talking about the state of Nevada and the need to protect it, that makes her a very strategic choice, as well as a very well-educated and, just a very great candidate for the vice presidency. And so I think, really embracing the Latino community full on is something that the Biden campaign can do politically, and it makes sense to do, whereas the administration currently most likely could not embrace the Latino community wholeheartedly and not lose any voters.
That is true, especially from what we hear from the Trump campaign. But they have made significant overtures to the African American community, and they're confident that they can pull away voters in this community. And we kind of saw this trap of tokenism for this vice presidential pick. If you guys, I don't know if you guys saw today, but Stacey Abrams is on with Vice President Biden in an interview, and it was very clear that she was expecting the vice presidential slot, and she kind of got brutally turned down during the midst of this interview. But I'm a little afraid that the Biden campaign is just going to put someone in a place of power purely because of the community that they are ethnically tied to, and this isn't the type of inclusion we want in any party, let alone the Democratic Party. Do you see this as a significant worry, or do people maybe they don't care?
I agree with you. I think that would be very damaging to the Democratic reputation to pick a vice presidential candidate solely based on their race. Now, and the ethnic communities that they may serve or may represent. However, the bad thing about politics, and the reason that so many people don't like politics, is that it's all about winning the game. And we created this blog because we wanted to break it down from beyond what seems to be just pure politics into the reasonings behind it. I don't believe Stacey Abrams was chosen solely because she's in a region that's not necessarily very important for Joe Biden. He by on all accounts and all polls, as well as the trends that have been seen in Georgia just simply isn't competitive this year. It has grown more competitive since 2016, sure. But as I said in the piece, I don't believe Texas and Georgia will truly be competitive until 2024, 2028, that area. And I think it was more of a strategic rather than racially based choice on Biden's part to not choose Stacey Abrams, solely because I think he's trying to focus on getting a running mate, one, that due to Joe Biden's age, is ready to assume the office were the worst to happen to him. And two, is able to draw together not necessarily just an ethnic coalition and bring in the groups that they serve, but also just broaden the moderate perspective that Joe offers. And while, again, back to the previous question, progressives are kind of being left out at this point. That's not necessarily the case. Biden has promised to work with Sanders and Warren on when it comes to crafting their platform during the general election. I think the progressive voices will be heard far more in 2020 than they were heard in 2016. And I think the vice president choice, while it sounds bad to say it's a game of politics, it truly does come down to a game of politics. Which person will offer Biden the best advantage in the most competitive place? And I genuinely think that there's only 3 women that can fill that slot. And that's my perspective. I don't speak for Hayden. But it's Kamala Harris, Gretchen Whitmer, and Elizabeth Warren. I think all 3 of those women offer competitive advantages in the region, especially Whitmer with the Rust Belt, Elizabeth Warren with the Northeast Maine 2nd Congressional District, and then Kamala Harris, which again, bringing in the solidifying the African American support Joe Biden already has, as well as being able to gain support in other heavily African American communities. I think those would be the 3 most strategic picks for Joe Biden going into VP.
You do mention that all 3 of these individuals are women. Now, it might not be true that Biden is tokenism in racial regards, but the only positive information we have about his VP choice so far is that it happens to be a woman. Now, is this a problem? Will this detract voters away just for this blatant tokenism, or do you not see it as a problem as well?
I have always been a firm believer that the person who's best suited for the job should be picked, whether it be a man or a woman. I do think Biden's. I think Biden could have very easily chosen a female VP candidate without announcing that he was solely going to pick them because they were a female. I think at that point when he announced that, he was just trying to get a one-up on Bernie Sanders in the primaries. I don't think that was necessarily the most appropriate thing he could have done. However, while that can be construed as bad, I also don't think it is. It can be construed as tokenism. It can be construed as sexism in a sense of he's picking a woman to appeal to women. But I think at the end of the day, the Biden camp is trying to show that they are going to reach into multiple groups. They're trying to win back over the white college educated women that helped Donald Trump in 2016 win in the key states in the Rust Belt in Florida and North Carolina. And he's trying to show that his campaign will be diverse in listening to as many people as possible. So I think it's, while the way he announced it and the way he went about it was purely a game of politics, I don't think that the outcome is really going to be as bad as implied.
Well, it's important to emphasize how important the Rust Belt is in this election. And in 2016, President Trump won the election because he won states in the Rust Belt. And when we went into these counties and communities and saw the data of why they voted for Trump, there is a linear correlation between the optimization of jobs in an industry to a vote for Trump. Mm-hmm. So shouldn't we have someone that's tackling the problems in these rural communities instead of someone that's just happens to be from the region?
Go ahead, Aiden, if you'd like to take this one.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. And I completely agree with you, Kyle, on just stating that, one of the main reasons why Donald Trump got elected in 2016 was because of his strong, just mention of the fact that many manufacturing jobs in the United States have been taken away due to automation, as well as just due to different manufacturing processes that have cropped up in the last few years. Now, I think that, yes, it is important to have people that are very involved in these communities that are affected by automation and the manufacturing sector. And I definitely, I resonate with that because, during the primary season, I was a huge supporter of the policies that Andrew Yang put forward, as well as his, description and his just willingness to go into issues that such as the automation of jobs. And one thing that I did find very encouraging, especially with Joe Biden becoming the presumptive nominee, is that he's incorporated some of those messages and some of those sentiments that candidates like Andrew Yang brought up with the automation of jobs into his policy platform and into what they want on the Democratic policy platform. And also, I think, when mentioning different senators or different vice presidential potential nominees that can come up out of the Rust Belt, I think that it's also important to note that a lot of the vice presidential candidates that are coming out of the Rust Belt are senators, are congresswomen, are people that have been involved with constituents that have dealt with the automation of jobs, as well as just the growing, economic inequality that we've seen in that area. And so I think that, yes, it is important that someone is taken not only because they come from the area, but because they've worked in that area and they understand the problems such as automation and manufacturing. And I do think that the Joe Biden campaign and that the Democratic Party are also acknowledging that in their choice of this vice presidential nominee.
And I also think that regardless of who the vice presidential nominee pick is, I think Joe Biden himself is going to resonate very well throughout the Rust Belt. Joe Biden was instrumental to President Obama winning the Rust Belt, especially Pennsylvania and Michigan in 2008 and 2012. And Joe Biden's role within the auto bailout in Michigan is going to resonate very well with those workers. Now, Trump's tariffs on steel and and oil and all those different things with China and other countries have really come to hurt those workers, because at the end of the day, while it creates jobs for steel workers when tariffs are increased, it decreases jobs all the way down the line, who refines the steel, who uses the steel, because it becomes more expensive. And so at the end of the day, Biden is going to resonate with the Rust Belt workers far more, because he's going to bring back the policies that helped them get out of trouble in the Great Recession, and as well as expand upon the job opportunities in the Rust Belt by decreasing tariffs with China and decreasing tariffs across the world.
So you said he can win in the Rust Belt, but you, in your article, you point out Iowa and Ohio as a huge waste of time for the Biden campaign. Now, what's the difference between Ohio and Michigan, or Ohio and Pennsylvania, that makes it unwinnable for Biden?
So yeah, Ohio's in the same general region. I also lumped Minnesota into, like, instead of just being the Rust Belt, like the Rust Belt region. The thing with Ohio is that while it may have the same demographics, more or less, as Michigan and Pennsylvania, it, for some reason, and I'm not exactly sure the cause, but it's been a trend, has been trending further and further to the right since the election of President Obama in 2012. We've seen that in the presidential election in 2016, where President Trump had a pretty commanding victory in Iowa and Ohio as well. And then in 2018 as well, they've shifted more to the right. The reasons for that, honestly, probably couldn't tell you. I definitely need to do more research onto the reasonings, but based on the polls since 2016, Ohio and Iowa and most pollsters have just placed them pretty firmly in the Trump camp. And the reason I said that Biden shouldn't focus on it as much is because those two states are not crucial. It's true that for approximately 7 or 8 election seasons, no president has won the election without the state of Ohio. But seeing that there are new battleground states in 2020 that were never seen before, the power of Ohio in deciding, especially Ohio and Iowa to a lesser extent, is much less than it was in 2008 and 2012. Joe Biden can afford to lose every state that Trump won in 2016, so long as he holds on to Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Those are the 3 states that matter in this election, or those 3 states plus Arizona are the states that matter in this election. And I never want to write off a state as saying it doesn't matter, but when you're playing the strategic game, if you just need to capture 3 states in order to win, those should be where you fund all of your resources and all of your time, because that's what's going to push you to 270. Ohio would be icing on the cake, and I think that if Biden spent enough time and money, he could make it competitive. But I think at the end of the day, Ohio and Iowa are firmly in the Trump column, and I don't think it's a good use of resources to try to sway them.
Now, is Florida in a similar situation as Ohio in your calculation? Because you state that Florida is a wild card, but
Yeah.
you don't put it in the Biden category.
Florida's wild. It's hard to predict from year to year. If you look at the polls, some have Biden leading, some have Trump leading. And at the end of the day, the polls as of right now have Biden up by about a percentage point. Now, a lot of people have placed polls in a bad light because of what happened in 2016. The only state that was really wrong was Wisconsin. All the other states that had Clinton ahead also had a fairly large margin of error, in which Trump won within the margin of error, which means the poll itself wasn't incorrect. They just had the wrong person on the winning side. And I think the same thing might be happening in Florida. Now, pollsters are learning from their mistakes in 2016. They are not making the assumptions that Democrats are just going to win states because they've gone Democratic for a long time. But Florida has a growing population of 45 plus. And as of today, Biden seems to be in the lead in those demographics. But historically, those demographics have always voted Republican. And I think that at the end of the day, that population is going to overwhelm Miami-Dade County, those areas that have vote heavily Democratic, and will sway Florida, but ever so slightly. So in my prediction, I have it as a tilt red state, which means that Trump will win by less than a percentage point. So that state is very much up in the air, because just enough resources and time in Florida could sway it to the other side. But I don't see either team winning Florida by more than a percentage point. I think Florida will be a true toss-up state for at least 2 more election cycles.
voter enfranchisement had a really good win in Florida recently this year. And Ray, back check me on this, but I believe 1 million convicted felons were re-enfranchised to vote in Florida. Those numbers heavily favor Democrats. Do you see that piece of legislation having a profound impact on the race, or is it a non-starter?
Go ahead, Hayden, if you want to take that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. I would say that...
1.4 million. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, you're perfectly fine. So the introduction of 1.4 million voters in any capacity and for any reason in any state is quite a significant number. However, I would say that it's pretty much a non-factor in terms of swaying the election one way or another. Obviously, a lot's going to change between now and November, and a lot has changed since that came into effect, and when voting season is going to officially kick off, in November, and we're going to find out who the next president is. So overall, I'd say it's pretty much a non-factor. I do think it's important to note that has happened and that is a development in Florida, and I think it's going to be interesting to see. I don't think it places the state in any firm column for either party, though. I think if anything, it just increases the, battleground nature of the state and the unpredictability of the state overall.
I'd like to talk a little bit now about Arizona specifically. You highlighted it in your piece. We're all living in Arizona. I've worked in Arizona for a while in politically, so I want to get your thoughts on who's the demographic that Biden needs to focus on and seduce to get them on their side.
So in Arizona, in every presidential election in recent history, the winner of the state has pretty much been decided by Maricopa County. If you look at 2018, when it was Governor Doug Ducey and Kristen Sinema as the two versus Martha Mcsalley, David Garcia, the big names on the ticket. Looking at it, Kristen Sinema won Maricopa County and then won her election, and Doug Ducey won Maricopa County and then won his election. So I think a big thing that Biden's going to need to focus on is, I can tell you one thing, Coconino County will more than likely vote blue, and Mojave County will 100% vote red. That's not going to change between now and November. Having lived in Mojave County, I can tell you that that's not going to change between now and November. But Maricopa County has shown that it has the ability to vote blue. And looking at the poll data, since they started polling in Arizona, since Arizona was seen as a truly competitive state, Joe Biden is up by about 3%, which is still within the margin of error. So it's still very possible that Trump could win on the state of Arizona. However, I think the demographic that Joe Biden needs to focus on in Arizona is, again, the Latino vote, which has been increasing in his favor, although it's still not an approval of him, but has been increasing since he became the presumptive Democratic nominee. And then also the youth vote in Arizona. I know that as we all go to Arizona State University is the largest university in the United States. It has 100,000 students, and approximately the voter turnout in 2018 was about 30%. Now, this is the first presidential election that many of us at the universities are going to be able to vote in, both all three, NAU, U of A, ASU. And I think that if Joe Biden can get in there and get the youth vote on his side, and with the support of probably people such as Bernie Sanders, people that had broad appeal to the youth vote. If he can win the youth vote in the state of Arizona, I can firmly see Arizona voting blue for the first time since Bill Clinton in 1996.
To give a little perspective on the youth vote, there has been some startling polls indicating that around 30% of Bernie Sanders supporters will not support Biden in the upcoming election as of right now. I know in the Andrew Yang camp, 42% of our people were not going to support Joe Biden to be the nominee. So a large part of those people are young people that are going to be concentrated in universities like ASU. So what does Biden need to do differently? Because just trotting out Sanders there and making him bend the knee is not cutting it right now.
Yeah, Hayden, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you repeat that real quick?
So how does Biden win the youth vote, especially in terms of Bernie Sanders supporters?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way that Biden really wins the youth vote is he manages to capture something that a lot of presidential candidates really can't do, and that's really energize the base. Now, that's going to be done through smart marketing. That's going to be done through thoughtful and really, really, impactful engagement in the state. And if Arizona is going to be one of those states where the Democratic Party sees it as an opportunity to flip. It sees it as an opportunity to have it vote blue for the first time since '96. I think that the way that the youth vote can really be engaged is through effective and meaningful engagement. I think what we saw with Bernie Sanders and Andrew Yang, particularly the two Democratic candidates that I think appealed to the younger voters the most, what we saw was that their genuine care and their genuine engagement was what really drew them out to the polls. Not the pandering, not really just focusing on them as young voters, but really trying to focus on issues that they care about. And so that's why I think, especially for Joe Biden, it's going to be important to see who he puts in his team for this election. If he puts in a lot of younger voices, a lot of different voices that can genuinely speak to the struggles, the issues, and the topics that young people care about, I think he's going to have a much better chance of winning over the youth vote in Arizona than the Trump campaign has.
Well, the Trump campaign has been increasing in those numbers, and there's a clear argument that Republicans, President Trump can make, and is that the neoliberal policies pursued during the Obama era, preceding in the Clinton era, and pretty much continued with Bush, has really put our generation behind on decades. And without tangible policy promises or commitments like a commitment to universal basic income or Medicare for all, I don't see how he can overcome that authenticity that a Yang or a Sanders brought to the table.
I see that. I see where you're coming from. However, at the end of the day, I think that the vast majority of youth disagree with how Trump has taken the country in the past 3 years. A lot of us, since 2016, have moved out of the house. We're experiencing many of the experiences that dictate who to vote for on our own for the first time in our lives. And I think that the youth have a higher priority on human rights, basic rights, treating people like an individual, mostly the ideals that the Democratic Party stands for. And I think that when it comes down to the election, more youth than we can predict will fall in line and will vote for Joe Biden simply because they don't want to see another 4 years of Trump. And
what exactly is the differences, though? Because are we talking about left-leaning class policy, or are we talking about economic liberal policy? Because the Democratic Party has done a very good job at appealing to our social, what we want culturally, but economically, they have been in line with conservatives since Clinton.
Yeah, I think the big defining difference for youth between Joe Biden and Donald Trump are the social changes that Joe Biden will either try to restore that have been disintegrating under the Trump administration, or the social change that he wants to bring to the table. And I think that by expanding things such as gay rights, abortion rights, the hot button issues that a lot of Democrats don't support, but that today's youth do, I think that by promoting those ideas, those values that have tended to be unpopular with the older generations, but are more popular with the youth vote, could help win the youth vote for Joe Biden. Youth tend to vote more on social issues than economic issues, whereas the elderly generation, not elderly, 45 plus generation tends to vote more with their pocketbooks. And that's just due to life experience and where you are. More youth are still trying to find their footing, and they don't understand necessarily how upturns, downturns of the stock market directly affect them, whereas those in the 45 plus category really do. And so I think at the end of the
I'd
day,
like to contend that point you just make. Out of all Americans, only the top 20% of people actually own stocks. In our own lifetime, since we're all around the same age in the youth bracket, we have seen two economic downturns compounded by 9/11 plus this pandemic. Are we really still on social issues as the driving factor? Because I would not categorize the Bernie Sanders movement as a social cultural movement, but an economic movement.
If Hayden wants to start off on this one, I can add on later. Go ahead, Hayden.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you definitely make some fine points there that, especially with the Sanders campaign and the revolution that they're trying to lead, it does come across as mainly an economic one. However, it's also a clever way of including social issues in some form of economic package or policy that you can pass. For example, when we look at Medicare for All or certain universal healthcare policies, that's a financial program that also can add to the social, I guess, policy marketing that the Democratic Party goes through, and especially with innovative policies like we saw through Andrew Yang in the Democratic primary with universal basic income, and essentially its implementation throughout this global crisis that we're going through. I think we're starting to see that the difference between social policy and economic policy is no longer as stark as it may have once been, or in my opinion, it never was that much of a difference. And I think that through the Biden campaign, if it can adjust to the crisis that we're currently experiencing and adjusting its policy to reflect that the economic policy is going to turn into the social policy, for example, investing in infrastructure and critical things that the current administration has not been able to follow through on, I think that then allows you to hit on the social policy ideas. So that allows you to hit on a lot of the, whether it be addressing the climate change issue, which some people view as a social issue primarily, and other people, including myself, view it as both a social and an economic issue. So I think if the Biden campaign and the rest of the Democratic Party can package it in such a way where they really focus on the economic details of these policy packages, it can also benefit the social policies that they're trying to advocate for.
I do agree that the issues are wrapped up in each other, in that the economic affects the social, which has a cyclical effect, impacting people's economic standards. But is the solution, can you have only one part of the solution right and still stand for our democratic values? Is there no more Theodore Roosevelt era redistribution into an adequate society, and where people have their basic floor under them and can move forward on their own? Or do we not redistribute wealth because it's at a point that it's becoming a systematic problem in the whole system, much like what happened during the Gilded Age, where wealth was just concentrated so much that one trip and the whole system collapsed again?
Aiden?
Yeah, absolutely. I can take that one. And I do agree that, the system's a little bit different than it was back in the Gilded Age of the late 1800s. And, I'm a pretty ardent supporter of capitalism. However, I would say that, Adam Smith's original dream for capitalism isn't necessarily viable in the modern day. And I do think that some form of, I guess, redistribution could be achieved. And I definitely think if that's what a lot of young people are looking for, is some form of redistribution of resources or wealth or technology or information or whatever it might be, I definitely think that the Biden campaign gives them the best shot at having that. I think one thing that we're seeing is a growing amount of support for some form of redistribution, if not in name and policy, due to the ongoing crisis and the implementation of the stimulus payments, as well as higher unemployment benefits and other social net programs that are coming through in this global crisis that we're going through. I think as we roll into election time, we're going to see that those programs are very popular among the American public. And regardless of its effect on the economy, I think any campaign that really promotes those types of policies, where it's redistribution of something in some form, I think that they're going to see a lot of success due to the popularity of a lot of these programs that are coming out currently during this crisis.
Now, in your article, Chase, you made a really interesting point about how Arizona can become basically the new Wisconsin swing state, and that Biden can afford to lose the Rust Belt Wisconsin vote if he wins Arizona. So how will these two states interplay in the next election, and why is Arizona the place to focus and not Wisconsin for the Biden campaign?
Yeah, so I think a very important thing to also remember is that the 2020 census is currently happening. Arizona is slated to gain anywhere between 1 and 3 additional electoral votes. Wisconsin's not slated to grow by nearly as much. So the electoral power of Arizona is only going to increase by the next election cycle. Also, when we look at the polls from 2012 through 2020, we see Wisconsin has grown increasingly less safe for the Democratic Party. So while right now Joe Biden is in the lead with the polls, which is why we characterized Wisconsin as a tilt Democratic state, I truly believe that it is possible by the 2020 election for Wisconsin to become a tilt Republican party or a tilt Republican state. However, Arizona since 2012 has grown increasingly less of a safe hold for the Republican Party. This is due mostly to the changing demographics, many people moving in from California, Nevada, New Mexico that have increased the Democratic population within the state of Arizona. And I don't see that, and most pollsters don't see that changing for many, many years to come. So I think by the 2024 elections, the roles of Wisconsin and Arizona and which party they safely vote for are going to be completely different. I do see Wisconsin becoming a relatively likely Republican voting state and Arizona becoming a relatively leaner, likely voting Democratic state. And I think that this is the first election where we might see those two states split. Prior to 2016, I mean, Hillary Clinton's campaign spent barely any time in Wisconsin because it went so strongly for President Obama in both 2008 and 2012. They didn't see the need to, quote unquote, waste resources on states that are safe. Same with Arizona. They didn't view Arizona as even a likelihood of winning, so they didn't put nearly as much money into their campaign in Arizona. In 2016, that was a smart move for Arizona. Arizona was very likely going to vote red, and it did by about a 4% margin in the 2016 election. But in the 2018 election, we saw a new growth of the Democratic Party. And in 2020, we're seeing the same thing. Martha Mcsalley versus Mark Kelly. Now, that's a little bit of a weird matchup solely because Martha Mcsalley's already been defeated once in a senatorial race. So people already view her negatively after having been appointed, after losing a Senate race. But Mark Kelly is a very strong candidate and is slated right now to defeat Martha Mcsalley. If that happens, it'll be the first time since 1953 Arizona has been represented by two Democratic senators. On top of that, both Democratic senators, as well as 5 of the 9 congressional representatives, are also Democratic. So legislatively, Arizona is slated to become a Democratic state when it comes to the House and Senate, and we don't see any reason for that trend to not carry over to the presidential level.
Well, the trends are all good. Campaigning does still have a significant effect on who eventually gets the primary or gets a nomination. Biden could have been defeated several times over if he was facing a harsher pool of candidates, and he won't be facing people with the kid gloves on with Donald Trump. And one of the biggest critiques of Biden right now is he seems like he's kind of just hanging back and not engaging in the campaigning style which we see in traditional candidates. Do you see this strategy backfiring, or does he need to play a more active role in crafting his own destiny, or is Trump hate enough to carry him over the nomination?
I think it's a bit of a mixture of both, especially with the state of the world right now. With coronavirus ravaging everything, it's hard to hold rallies. It was even hard to hold that last Democratic debate back in March. I think with the coronavirus pandemic, traditional rallies, traditional campaigning events are going to have to change substantially for the 2020 election. And I think both parties are struggling as of right now, as of late, to redefine what campaigning looks like in a purely, as of now, virtual world. Many of us don't have cable. Most youth don't have cable, at least. So they're turning to things like YouTube ads, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, which we've seen used far more in this election than they've been used in previous elections. And I think that as we get closer to November and the coronavirus pandemic will more than likely start to taper off, so long as we hold firm on the measures we're taking, I think we will see a stronger Biden presence in many of these battleground states. And I think also, to talk to your latter point, Trump hate is so strong in these battleground states right now. While he may have a positive approval rating in the Deep South, minus Georgia, Florida, but in the Rust Belt, all 3 of those states and in Arizona have a net negative approval rating for the president. and especially over his handling of the coronavirus epidemic. And I think that if we see in November that we're voting by mail, the coronavirus epidemic isn't over, people are going to be so dissatisfied with the Trump team that they will vote for Biden, just based off of that. And Americans tend to have very short-term memories. They remember the latest scandal, and that helps to decide their voting. And so I think that this coronavirus pandemic is really going to put a chokehold on the Trump campaign. And so I think while Biden does need to take a stronger stance when it comes to campaigning in these states, I think in many of them his win is inevitable just because of their ratings of President Trump.
This pandemic has certainly been in Biden's favor. One of the few issues I trust Biden on is his handling of infectious disease. The Obama White House did a great job with the epidemics during Obama's tenure. They put in the proper systems and handed it off the most sophisticated global health network ever created. And President Trump dismantled it in this vein of governmental libertarianism incompetence. So I do think it's a very good thing in terms of Biden electorally, what we're going through right now.
Agreed. I think that this definitely favors Joe Biden when it comes to the polls in November.
Now, let's get on some general questions. Let's talk a little bit about the media. So how do you believe media coverage will shape public opinions in the following months, especially in terms of the youth vote, where it's more complicated with new media and old media fighting it out?
So I think it's been very interesting to see how the media has picked up the Tara Reade allegations against Joe Biden. When there were allegations against Trump, albeit there were far more against Trump than there is against Biden, it was on every news network all the time. Now, with these new allegations against Joe Biden, it's kind of been pushed to the wayside. And while I don't think that that's right, I think at the end of the day, that benefits Joe Biden. And I think the reason a lot of it's been pushed to the wayside is because of the pandemic. That is higher priority news to most Americans than a sexual assault scandal. And that is awful to say. And I really wish the media would do a better job reporting on it, because it is very important to know the paths of both of the candidates that are up for election. However, with the pandemic going on, many of these things aren't seen as front page news. And I think that the effect of the media on the 2020 campaign won't truly be felt until the fear and dread of the American people when it comes to the coronavirus is over. And so there hasn't been an opportunity for the media to pick up a Trump v. Biden story, because there hasn't really been any Trump v. Biden action. And so I think that until we see debates where, whether virtually or in person, and until we see some true clashing between the two on a public stage, we're not really going to see the true effect of the media when it comes to the election in November.
To talk about democratic values before we move on to more general questions, you did mention the Tara Reade scandal that's going on right now. With everything, taking everything at its value from Tara, should the Democrats be replacing Biden, or are we morally obligated to?
Hayden, if you want to take that one.
Thank you very much. I think it is an interesting question that's posed, especially to the Democratic voter base, a voter base that traditionally, especially over the last 3 to 4 years, has stood up, proudly in believing sexual assault allegations and trying to find trying to give them at least some semblance of justice. And I think that, especially in this situation, I think the public viewpoint has changed a little bit. Not really changed, but from the outside looking in, a lot of people, when they heard, Me Too movement or something like that, they believed that it just meant to believe survivors outright, regardless of any evidence that they had or that was against them. And I think that, reading articles and, looking at the responses from a lot of Me Too organizers, the true intent of that belief and that movement was to not to believe them outright, but to believe them to the point, give them a fair shot, give them a fair trial, give them, some ability to find justice.
Is that really what Democrats believe? During the Kavanaugh hearings, I do not see the same standards applied to him as to Vice President Biden right now. Is that really a fair argument?
I think in a way it's a fair argument. I definitely agree with your sentiment. I think that, in some form or fashion, there's been a lot of compromises made from the Democratic Party and the voter base as far as, I guess, moral viewpoints go. And I think, yes, if I were in the judgment seat, I definitely think that the media should focus more on these allegations and, try to find the credence behind it. But I also think that it's important to note that through this, we've also seen that this just highlights how much people are against the current administration, at least, in a lot of different demographics, and how much they're willing to compromise with in order to see at least some form of change. And then maybe after the election, focus on, the main issues that we're looking at right now. I know it's not an ideal, but that's currently what we're looking at with the media, with public opinion, is that more people are focused on the election than the issues surrounding it.
And I also think that it's very hard to not see that this has brought out the general brokenness of the American political system. Because in 2016, over 20 plus sexual assault allegations were brought against Donald Trump, and the Republicans still went forward with him. And in the 2020 campaign, we're seeing, not to the same extent, but the same situation happening with Joe Biden. And I would not say that either party is in the right with their decision. We've seen some more action from the Democrats than we've seen from the Republicans, such as forcing Al Franken to resign during the midst of his sexual allegation scandals and things like that have shown the Democratic Party is willing to take more action than the Republican Party. But the problem is both parties are so focused on just winning this election. They're unwilling to see the flaws within their own candidates that could potentially lead to their undoing. And that's for the American people to decide in the coming months. And it pains me to know that these issues are being pushed to the wayside as they're truly important. And I would love to see, again, in an ideal America, two parties that will take sexual allegations seriously and actually do something about them. And unfortunately, right now in our political climate, we see two parties so focused on winning an election that they, for the most part, are sacrificing a lot of their moral grounds in order to do it. And it's very disappointing to see.
So you said two parties recognizing this is ideal, but are two parties ideal for the American system? Because election after election, people are asked to compromise their values in exchange for the lesser of two evils. Is it time to dissolve the system where there's only two choices?
I've personally never been a fan of the two-party system. Our own founding father, George Washington, said that we should never let it get to a two-party state. I think that the best method for the American people would be something similar to what they use in the British Parliament, a proportional representation system, so that we can at least get some third-party candidates into office. The hard thing is that the two-party system is so ingrained into American political culture that's all that the American people really know, and that's all that the two parties are comfortable with. I don't think, at least in the near future, we're going to see any change to the two-party system, and that's much to the chagrin of me, you, and many, many Americans. I believe that a proportional representation would be better, because then if the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, wins in the state of California, wins 10% of the vote, they get 10% of the seats, rather than, or in a district where it's important for everyone to feel represented. And instead of representatives being elected in districts, I think it's better for the state to elect representatives the same way that they elect senators, on a statewide ballot, and that it's a proportional proportional representation. So if a district has 10 seats and the Democrats win 50% of the vote, the Republicans win 40% of the vote, and the Libertarians win 10% of the vote, 5 Democrats, 4 Republicans, and a Libertarian are all sent to Congress. And I think that's the best way to ensure that the American people's voices are heard and they don't have to pick the lesser of two evils. They could finally, for once in a long time, vote for a candidate that they support, that they like, that they want to see in office, not vote for a Democrat because they don't want the Republican to get the seat. And so I think that if we were able to do, again, a proportional vote allocation on the congressional and even federal level, I think we would see support for third parties grow much faster than anticipated because people could finally vote for a candidate that they support, not a candidate that they like more than, or that they hate less than the other.
Remind me to pen and paper about ranked choice voting with you. It would definitely help with the proportional representation scheme you were elaborating on. But I want to move a little bit beyond that. Traditionally, states' rights and greater states enfranchisement has been a Republican ideal. But now that we've seen a strong national government in the hands of someone that should not have these executive powers, is it time to return some powers to the state governments? It was Thomas Jefferson who said that democracy doesn't work if it's this big. In the founding fathers, they were talking about 2 million, 3 million people with their federal government, and they thought that was unrepresentative enough. Now we're talking about 320 million people being represented under a federal government. So is it time to return powers to the states?
I think it's never a bad time to give states a little more rights. However, I think that the failure of what's happened since 2016 isn't because the federal government is too big. It's because the oversight of the federal government is not enough. We've seen, so the whole point of the 3 branches of government is to allow each branch to be able to check each other's power. And with the judicial branch having a largely conservative majority on the court, although Justice Roberts often plays a swing vote, but he tends to vote conservative, as well as from 2016 to 2018, when the houses were controlled by the Republican parties, we did not see much oversight coming from the other 2 branches of government. And now that Trump has been firing watchdogs and inspector generals left and right, I see a problem growing, as in the executive branch just is not being checked. And this is not the first presidency to have experienced that, but this is the first presidency to where it's gotten to this extent. And so
is it really the presidency, though? The biggest disasters of our lifetimes have been the 2008 crash and the economic response from the coronavirus pandemic right now. And that is purely coming from both branches of Congress passing massive bailouts to corporations. It seems like it's a bipartisan issue to funnel these funds to corporate oligarchs. So is it really a party problem and not a checks and balance problem?
Hayden?
I think you're really accurate in assessing that situation. I think that we do see, especially in our modern system, which is why I'm glad that you brought up ranked choice voting and, proportional representation, because I believe there is some need for a shift or a change in the political system and how America sees its politics, because currently we do have a lot of corporatism in politics on both sides of the aisle. It just so happens that during this whole entire global crisis, we have seen that in the executive branch, we have a Republican administration, and that's kind of the face of it. And I think it's a mix of both. I think it's not only, a bipartisan issue, but I also do think it's a balance of power. I think that, overall, a lot of the corruption and a lot of the greed that we do see in Washington and basically all over our country in different legislative and, different political branches, a lot of it has to do with just the nature of a political class that is in America. You have the lower class, working class, and I do believe that there's some sort of political class that, not only highlights the growing corruption that we do see in Washington, and we've seen in Washington since the founding of our nation, but also highlights the fact that there's a severe lack in the balance of powers and the checks and balances that need to exist between the different branches of government.
Yeah, that all makes sense in my mind. Like, it's been pretty clear that we've been trending away from political disenfranchisement. I believe there was a report from Clinton's Labor Secretary Robert Reich in which he said that Americans have zero political power if even if they vote, because their votes doesn't correspond to the issues they want seen or the laws passed. So one of our proposals during the campaign was a policy called democracy dollars, in which we give $100 specifically for campaign funds for every American. Are Is that the future of the Democratic Party? This radical enfranchisement of Democratic voters, or are they going to continue with the same style of neoliberalism that's been the ruling philosophy for them?
Hayden, I know this is something you've looked into.
Yeah, I mean, I loved the proposal that the Yang campaign put forward in the primary season with the idea of democracy dollars. I thought it was a fantastic idea. The problem that I have currently is that I love the idea. I really wish it could work. But with the current structure of not only our economy and our political system, but also our social system, where a lot of our celebrities, the people that we look up to, are people with a lot of money and power. I believe that it's going to be really hard, especially with a lot of politicians and a lot of policymakers having contacts and having connections with a lot of these corporations. It's going to be hard to see something like that realized. I think if there is going to be a movement to bring Americans back into the political system, the regular average Americans, and giving them that feeling of being involved in policymaking, not only at the local level, but the national level, some form of democracy dollars or some form of actual genuine connection to policy being put in place is going to be necessary to see the American democracy and the American experiment continue to progress and continue to go forward in a way that would be, that would make the founders proud and would make every American proud.
And another facet of American democracy, something that's weighed pretty heavily on me and something on which my viewpoints have changed drastically over the years, is the Electoral College. I fundamentally think the Electoral College is a flawed system for a country of our size. I understand the purpose of why the founders put it into place, but I think in our day and age, it's important for each American to feel that their vote matters as equally as the person standing next to them. I grew up in the great state of Wyoming, a state a lot of people don't think exists, but I can tell you it exists. And my vote was equivalent to about, I think, 12 Californian votes. And that's absolutely ridiculous. I think that one vote should correlate to one vote, and that whoever wins the popular vote, and while that's trending Democratic over the years, that shouldn't be the rationale for anyone to support or not support abolishing the Electoral College. I do not think that the Electoral College fairly represents America, because it basically tells, if in a state such as Florida, if in 2000, when Gore lost the state of Florida by 500 votes, that basically told all of the Gore supporters, yeah, so even though you pretty much had the same number of votes as President Bush, they don't matter. They don't count. I think the Electoral College is one of the least democratic things that we have instituted in our election cycles. And this is coming from someone who 4 years ago was a staunch supporter of the Electoral College. I loved it. I thought it was the best. And over time, I've come to see that it's really not fair, because you're telling an American in the Midwest that just because you are in a swing state, you get to see more of the candidates. Whereas it should be all Americans should have access to the candidates, because every vote counts, not certain states count. And while in every election since 1776, it's been the states that mattered, I would really love to see a transition to where people matter and votes matter.
Yeah, I remember during the campaign, Andrew joked about each Iowan being worth 1,000 Californians in terms of their electoral power. That doesn't seem right in my mind either. There is a good faith argument by the other side that these states will become even more irrelevant than they already currently are without the system in place. Like, they're already called flyover states. So how do you kind of balance that people in Wyoming and Iowa still need to be heard and their voices would be drowned out more under a purely one person, one vote system?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll take this one. So one thing I think is interesting is I definitely agree with Chase in that, every person's vote should matter. And I agree with what you said as well, that it's kind of ridiculous that, one Iowan can count for 1,000 Californians in a voting thing. I think the way that we transition and we keep, especially those quote unquote flyover states, viable in presidential elections and important presidential elections is doing some sort of system that allows the Electoral College to function in a proportional way. So focusing more on like county by county or essentially, seat by seat areas. And so the way that we can actually, this will, I believe personally that this will actually increase the amount of involvement that voters have. For instance, we see in solid states, solid blue states and solid red states, that the margin of victory is drastic, like just insane, especially in California or New York or states like, Alabama and other states that are solid Republican states. I think the way that we can fix this and, both move to a state where each American's vote does matter while still valuing states that maybe have lesser populations is through some form of system where we hand out Electoral College votes proportionally. That way, the Republican voters in California actually feel like their vote matters. And the Democratic voters in Iowa feel like their vote matters. And the Democratic voters in the great state of Virginia or, all these different states, or even in Arizona, a state that might be a toss-up state where, you move, instead of granting 100% of the electorate's political power in Electoral College votes, you grant a participant, or sorry, not participant, a candidate that won 60% of the vote as close to 60% of the Electoral College votes that they earned. That way, it not only does value each individual's vote, because as we can see, like those percentages can change through very marginal votes, especially in states like Wyoming and states like North Dakota and South Dakota, where there might not be that many voters. And so that way, we not only give power to the states and to the Electoral College system and modernize the Electoral College system, but we also give power to individual voters and saying that regardless of what state you live in, you still have voting power. Even if your state in prior elections looked like an incredibly safe democratic state, you still have some power and you might actually see your feelings, your presidential preference seen in the Electoral College. That's just my personal thoughts, though.
And I completely agree with. I agree with her. Sorry.
That makes a lot of sense to me.
I think that the way we do what Hayden implemented is we already have states that do something similar. Look at Maine and Nebraska, who award their electoral votes based on their congressional districts. Well, if we cannot get everyone to agree that we should do one vote is one vote, we should at least be able to do it based on the congressional districts. Because for example, in Arizona, we have 9 representatives in Congress, and we have 11 electoral votes. So we have 2 electoral votes at large for whoever wins the state popular vote, and then we have 9 electoral votes that go based off of how that congressional district votes. And that's probably, to get the agreement, the closest we can get to having a one vote equals one vote system. Because I can tell you, I have a lot of friends who live in California who are Republicans, and they choose not to vote because they know that their one vote will make absolutely no difference in the outcome of the state of California. However, Orange County votes traditionally Republican, and they live in Orange County, and their county sends a Republican representative to Congress every 2 years. But the difference is it's not winner take all. It's still winner take all, but it's not statewide winner take all when it's down to a congressional district. I think if states were more willing and open to adopt the policies of Nebraska and Maine and just award like their electoral votes based off who wins their congressional district and then what the 2 remaining for whoever wins statewide, that is the closest and most fair way for us to allocate electoral votes without having to totally abolish the Electoral College system. It's worked in Nebraska and it's worked in Maine, so I don't see why it couldn't work in states like California or Alabama.
To round this question off, this conversation off, I'd like to ask a little bit about Biden's strategy with Republicans. Traditionally, at this point of the campaign, after one person has solidified their foothold, they pivot right or left if they happen to be a Republican, and try to appeal to people across the aisle. But Biden's been forced to appeal further left to a constituency that is not yet solidified under his control. So, what is his strategy should be to get Republicans on his side and balancing the needs to please the left?
Yeah, sure. So I believe that any Republicans that are disgruntled with Donald Trump will not, I mean, everyone needs campaigning, but will not need as much campaigning in order to sway them because they've already made up their minds that they choose not to vote for the president. I also agree that the vast majority of Democrats, somewhere I think the latest poll is somewhere around 95%, 90%, will vote for Joe Biden over Trump no matter what. I think Joe Biden already has the moderate Democratic voters and some of the liberal Republican voters already locked in for his campaign. I don't see any reason as to why they would vote for Donald Trump, especially if they're already disgruntled with him. I think it is a far better strategy for Joe Biden to remain a centrist candidate, but have advisors and seek endorsements from progressive candidates who can speak on a more personal level, senators, representatives who work more closely with their constituents to make sure that they understand that Joe Biden has their ideas and their policy goals implemented throughout if he were to be elected throughout his administration, so that way their voice isn't drowned out while still allowing him to have that broad moderate appeal that will garner him the vast majority of his votes.
What you say makes a lot of sense. But how do you get the left to trust what Biden says he will do? He's been in power for a long time now, at least 3 decades in my remembrance. He has not swayed significantly on a lot of his policies, especially the ones important to the left. So if your strategy is surrogates towards the Biden campaign, what do they say?
And what I would say to that is you can never trust a politician. Whenever a politician has their mouth open, they're lying. Doesn't matter if it's Donald Trump. Doesn't matter if it's Joe Biden. Doesn't matter if it's Elizabeth Warren. Doesn't matter if it's Paul Ryan. I don't care.
I trust Andrew Yang.
Okay, well, yes, Andrew Yang. I won't get into that. I trust Andrew Yang too. I trusted Pete Buttigieg.
Thank you, Chase.
But we don't all get what we want. We're left with what we have. Career politicians will never hold up to the promises they make to get elected. It's a historical fact, and it's a historical fact that sucks. And at the end of the day, you're never going to find, well, at least for this election cycle, who knows, maybe 2024 will be run by angels. But in the 2020 election, you will not have a candidate that will do as they promise. So you have to vote for the candidate that you think will do more of what they promise that aligns with your beliefs. There are some things that Trump has said that personally I agree with. We do need immigration reform. Now, is it the same immigration reform he proposes? Absolutely not. But there are far more things that Joe Biden has said and promised to do that I believe in. Now, do I think Joe Biden will do 90, 80, 60, 40% of what he says? Not really. But will he do more for what I believe in than what Donald Trump will? You can bet your ass that he will. And that's the reason why I'm going to end up voting for Joe Biden in November, because he is the bus stop that gets me closest to where I want America to be. And while you can never trust a politician, I mean, you can't trust a lawyer half the time. They're lying too. But at the end of the day, whatever gets you where you want, as close to where you want to be, that's the person you have to go with. And it might not be the prettiest route, and it might not be a direct route, but at the end of the day, you'll be closer to the end than the start.
I'd like to impress on anyone listening to this that the situation doesn't have to be that dark.
No, agreed. 100% agreed.
Like, I see reports from New Zealand that that the prime minister's numbers there are just astronomically high, and they're already kind of getting back to reopening their society.
Well, I really wish we could do that here in the United States, but people don't like to stay home, so it's still spreading.
Last question that I'd like to ask our the people who come on. For those who are just turning in this episode, we are a branch of Humanity Forward Arizona. That's a political advocacy nonprofit that's meant to advocate for UBI, data rights, and human-centered capitalism here in AZ. What are your guys' recommendations of what we do next? How do we further our goals?
I'll let Hayden start off with this one.
Yeah, so I strongly agree with a lot of the sentiments that Humanity Forward pushes and really advocates for both at the local level and the national level. I think, if anything, during this crisis, we have seen the need for individual people such as yourselves who work with the Humanity Forward campaign, at least in Arizona, and at the national level, people that work with the campaign, and just local organizing and seeing how important that is. I think moving forward, the next best steps, is just continuing to have that genuine interaction with people that are in your communities, people that are at the national level. Because one of the things that, I would say that we're seeing in this country as of right now is just the importance of having those genuine connections and those genuine, conversations with people. A lot of times people will just see they'll look at Washington and they'll see, well, it's just a bunch of people talking. But the moment, such as with Humanity Forward, where we've seen people actually reaching out to private citizens and trying to get help to private citizens who are in need, I think we're starting to see some really positive changes that we haven't seen in a long time in this country. And really my biggest recommendation with how we move forward and how Humanity Forward moves forward with their policy ideas and, the fantastic innovative ideas that it's bringing forward is continuing to really just show genuine engagement with the constituents, with people in their communities, whether that be through volunteer work or through advocacy on Capitol Hill. I think the more people can see that there are people that care about these issues and that are showing that these issues do matter to every American and matter to every American household, no matter what race, religion, or creed that you follow, that everyone is important. I think that's one of the biggest things that I appreciate about Humanity Forward. It's not a Democratic movement. It's not a liberal movement. It's not a conservative movement or a Republican movement. It's an American movement. And more so, it's a human movement. And I think that's the most important thing, is that if it can keep its branding as a human movement, which I believe strongly that it is, it's going to continue to be effective and continue to grow in ways that I can't even imagine right now.
Thank you for those kind words. I kind of view that core crux of keeping it on a human level as maybe our most difficult task ahead of us. Because in the world of politics, you ultimately have to use Jason's analogy, choose a bus stop that's going to get you closer, but that leads you to sacrifice on your morals or get hinge on something you might not want to. So it's going to be important to maintain that. Thanks, Ed.
I think that the best way to move forward is for all voters to really listen to their hearts, and that sounds mushy and that sounds weak compared to some that should be logical, but elections aren't logical. They're purely, they are logical to a certain extent, but they're fueled by your emotions. Who do you feel is going to support you? Who do you feel is going to support your ideals? And I think that the best way for the American people to get someone into office that they believe cares about them and that they believe will make a difference is to listen to themselves and listen to their ideas and find their values and their ideals within themselves and vote for the candidate that best aligns with those. And I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat or you vote for Donald Trump or you vote for Joe Biden. All I want is for every registered voter to do what they think is the right thing. And the outcome of the election will be the outcome of the election. But if at the end of the day, you can look at yourself and say, I voted for what I believed in, then I think you did the right thing. Whether that's a third party, whether that's a Democrat or Republican party, whether that's not voting. Now, a lot of people shame people who don't vote, and I understand the reasons why. But if you truly believe that there's not a candidate that will take you where you want to be or as close as possible, and you don't want to vote for the president, then don't vote for the president. At the end of the day, what you think is right for you is right for you. And whether it's right for the person next to you or the person that lives across the street doesn't matter, because it's your life and it's your vote. And if you're voting for the person that you believe will make your life better, can help make other people's lives better, then that's the right decision. And so I think for the best move forward is to take off the focus of we have to kick Donald Trump out of office or we have to elect Biden, and more so say which candidate is going to better my life, and that is the candidate I will vote for. America would be in a much better place if they could simply take their minds out of it and focus on what is the best for me, what is the best for my family, what is the best for my country. And that's how I think we need to move forward and progress.
All right, thank you, Chase. This was a great conversation, guys. Had a lot of fun. How about you guys plug what you guys are working on, and we'll end it off.
Definitely. So as Kyle mentioned at the beginning, I am the founder of Cracked Up Politics. It's a political blog where my friend Hayden and I, and we're working on gathering a couple other contributors, write all things politics from elections to just the daily ongoings of the candidates. We'll be adding more content over the coming weeks, and especially a lot more content as we get closer to November. The website is crackeduppolitics.com. There's a contact section that comes right to me. So if you ever want to get in contact with Hayden and I and the rest of our team, feel free to use that. We'd love to hear from you, and we hope that you'll consider checking out our blog.
crackeduppolitics.com. Guys, remember to go check it out. Support the people that are kind enough to engage in a conversation with us. As always, everyone, remember to subscribe, like, comment on our channel to support the Humanity First movement. A reminder, please sign up for the Humanity Hangs. They are a great way to connect with people, and you get to meet Andrew like I have. Please sign up to become a COVID relief caller. Arizona hopes to make 200 calls by the end of May. That will be $50,000 in people's pockets, that people that are in need and need the extra support, and we need the callers to make this happen. And let your Yang Gang friends know this is the official spot to receive high-quality news from the Humanity First movement. Remember, you can always step forward. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you.